My name is Nadine O'Regan. I'm the arts editor with the Sunday Business Post, and it's my pleasure today to welcome Julian Barnes to the festival. As you know, he is a prolific writer and an unbelievable award winner. He has won so many awards. I don't even know where to start with him, although I will try. He's won the Booker Prize, of course, in 2011 for his novel The Sense of an Ending. He's also the author of many other fine novels, including Flaubert's Parrot, England's England, and the book I've been most recently reading, The Only Story, an absolutely gorgeous work. Alongside that, he's also been publishing non-fiction in the shape of essays and journalism for a long time. He actually, in some respects, got his start in the world of journalism, writing for publications such as The New Statesman. One of the things I love about Julian Barnes' work is how different it can be from book to book. He's not afraid of trying new things. He's not afraid of moving into new genres. He's even had a tilt at crime fiction under the guise of Dan Kavanagh. And every time I come to a work by Julian Barnes, there's a sense that I'm not sure which Julian Barnes I'm going to be getting. And for an author who is, if you'll forgive the expression, advanced in his career, it's a wonderful thing to be surprised.
You mean most old guys just repeat themselves, is that what you're saying?
Advanced in his career. So stick with the very simple. But so just first off, a round of applause for Julian. Julian, I suppose just to start, before we get into talking about the books and the non-fiction and indeed the short stories, I'd love to hear a little bit about your background because you've almost been adopted by French people as one of them because your affiliation with France is so well known and you've written about France so beautifully. But actually, you grew up very much in England and with two parents who were both school teachers, I believe.
Yes, they were. They both taught French. My father also taught German. And I went to France for the first time when I was about 13. It seems miraculous, the change around nowadays. You meet a child about 5 who says, have you been to San Francisco? I rather prefer it to Tokyo. And things like that. And you think, gosh, we got a car for the first time when I was about 13, and then we set off to France, and you had to go through all sorts of bureaucracy to get there. And we drove around in Paris, shattering and things like that. And we did that every year until I was about 18. And I think I was 20 before I first went to another foreign country. So I think one of the reasons that France bulks so largely in my writing is that it's my other country, it's my other language, it's the way. If I want, one of the ways in which I want to look back on my own country, I can see it through French eyes. And it's always helpful to have another set of eyes, another country. But that doesn't make me French or anything like that, because if I'm in France and I say, it's very nice that you like me and you like my work, is it because I'm a bit continental? And they say, no, you're just so English. And I sort of admit that after a while. I can't get away from it.
Yeah. Well, you make it sound as though it was this blissful adolescence going to France with your parents, but I believe it was rather less, maybe a little bit more angsty than that.
Oh, yes, no, it was certainly very angsty. My first night in France, we went from Newhaven to Dieppe, and in those days, your car was put on a kind of wooden pallet, and the crane hoisted it into the hold of the ship, and then it came out the other end. None of this drive on, drive off stuff. And we drove down into Normandy to a town called Cagny-Barville. It seemed very strange that they had hyphenated names for French towns. And on the first morning, my father said, go over the road and get me a newspaper. I said, well, what have we got? So he gave me some money. And I said, I thought, how do I say that? And as I was crossing the road, not looking if I was going to get run down, I was saying, Le journal de la région, le journal de la région, s'il vous plaît. And I was getting really hyped up. And I got there and I walked in, and of course everyone looks like a knife murderer or a rapist or something like that. And then you mumble your words and you come back with the newspaper, and it seems amazing. I mean, but it made me, that sort of age of nervousness was always there for several years, because it's the first time you had food with vinaigrette on. The cheese, it was completely different. They served meat that was sort of red. It was very peculiar. And my brother had similar, different but parallel sort of anxieties. So it was part of it was eye-opening. It was you were one of there weren't many other British cars or foreign cars on the roads. If you saw another British car coming towards you, you'd wave. Some people hooted, but my mother thought that was vulgar. So we invented. And there were certain things which were, there's no boredom like adolescent boredom. I'm sure you'd agree. Nothing is more killing than being bored as an adolescent. And we used to go round chateaus of the Loire and other places, and there would be enormous tapestries, and you'd have a guided tour, and the guide would explain everything that was going on in the tapestry. And this was my idea of boredom, the ultimate. Please come and find a seat. And it's taken me. What did you say? I was advanced in my...
Advanced in your career. I think we stuck with this phrase now.
So it was not really until I became advanced in my career that I actually just the other day went to Paris and saw the unicorn tapestries and the Musée de Cluny, which are absolutely staggering. And I immediately thought, I've got to see all the great tapestries of the world. So some things that you feel you've been anaesthetized for life, but you can get over them. That's one of the pluses of being advanced.
You mentioned that your mum wasn't a big fan of the beeping because she thought it was a bit vulgar. I get the sense that your parents were a little bit more conservative than you were.
More conservative? Well, my mother was certainly would have been. It was conservative, yes. But we didn't talk about politics in the family. Didn't talk about sex, religion, and politics. The classic three.
But there was no real history of writing in the family. But your mother did write a letter once.
My mother once wrote a letter to the Evening Standard, which was published, cut out, and put on the mantelpiece, and it was something to do with students getting pregnant and expecting still to be paid by the government or something like that. My father's much more liberal, but again, not an expressive liberal.
Was there a great sense of expectation as to what you would do with your life?
Not one that they imposed on either me or my brother. Everything is very English. Everything was sort of osmotically received, and so you knew what you shouldn't do, and then from that you worked out what you could do.
But they must have been very proud when you arrived at Oxford. You were on a scholarship, weren't you?
Yes, but again, it was the letter arrived to say that I got a scholarship. And it was addressed to me. I opened it and I said, I've got a scholarship. My mother said, yes, we thought it was that. and then they allowed me to watch any television I liked for the next week. As we had a television set which only got BBC, but didn't get ITV. ITV was a bit vulgar, BBC was okay. Mind you, the set only got BBC, so there wasn't a choice. So I sort of watched, what was that? as the Lone Ranger or that sort of equivalent, but that was only on once a week anyway, so I didn't get huge benefit from it. But they were proud of me behind my back, which I did subsequently discover, and that's English.
It is the English way.
Yes, the English way.
Yeah.
Don't make him. If you praise him, he might get too full of himself. That sort of stuff. Looking back, I would have minded a bit more praise. At the time.
Were you a keen reader from an early age?
Yes, I was a keen reader, but I was, as far as we used to go to the library regularly, and I'd take out books. But I tended to read the stuff that was standard to my age. I read, Scholes and Billy Bunter and things like that. I loved sort of adventure comics. I think I liked narrative. I think I liked character. I got the basis of it. And then at a certain point I started reading grown-up fiction, as it was called, or delivered to me. But it's a slow process learning to read. And there are certain books that you don't really. I mean, I was given Jane Austen to read when I was 16, 17, 18. I didn't get it. I didn't see the point of it. I think I only began to get Jane Austen when I was about 40, in my 40s. One of my key top books of the 20th century is Foremost Falls The Good Soldier. But again, it's a very, very complicated narrative. I mean, it's done as a spoken voice, really, and it was done by Ford. He dictated it to a secretary. And it's incredibly complicated, and you don't quite know what to believe. It starts off with the line, "This is the saddest story I've ever heard." And he wanted to call it the saddest story, but he didn't. This is the saddest story I've ever heard. So it makes you think that the person who says that as a first line is going to tell you a story which he's heard from someone else. Whereas in fact, it's a story in which he is up to his neck in, up to his heart in, up to his guts in. And he's someone who is not good at telling a story. And so if you try and read that, and it's also about the passions of life. And if you try and read that at 18 or so, you might vaguely get what the storyline is, but you don't get the subtlety of the way it's told.
Did you have a go at some of the most famous Irish writers around that time? Likes of, did you go for Ulysses in the way that so many people studying English or the arts in college would desperately try to?
I actually, every so often, each year there were prizes you could compete for. And because my school was in the centre of London, the man who handed out the prizes was the Lord Mayor of London. And when I was about 17, I think, I won an English prize. And you had to go to a special department of W.H. Smith in some office building, not open to the public. And there were the range of books which you could choose as your prize. And they'd obviously been sort of selected and sanitized. But amazingly, I found a copy of Ulysses. And I knew it was a dirty book. Everyone knows that. Everyone knew that then. And so I chose it. And it was, I can still remember the look. Fortunately, the Lord Mayor had gloves. And so he was able to pass me a copy of Ulysses without staining his London fingers with it. I didn't get on with it terribly well, and I think I didn't read it. I didn't read it all until I was in my 40s again. And I think it's parts of it are absolutely brilliant, and parts of it are a bit jocose and boring, shall we say, towards the middle.
Well, Roddy Doyle got into trouble for saying it needed a good editor.
Yes, well, Frank O'Connor, who I revere, and have done 2 editions of, one for Penguin and one for Vintage in America. He thought that it was a sort of short story that's gone terribly wrong.
Well, you mentioned mentioned that it was known as the dirty book, and I was fascinated reading a little bit about your life, that after you finished at Oxford, you found yourself working on the Oxford English Dictionary,
Yes.
but specifically this is your quote, sport and dirty words section.
Yes, that's right. They were preparing a new supplement to the Oxford English Dictionary in 24 volumes, which and it had been a previous supplement in 1933, so it's doing all the language from a bit before 1933 to the 1960s. And it was a very quiet office, and most of the people employed were Don's wives. And so I was held to know certainly more about sport, and possibly, mainly through my reading, more about sex than they did. And so the job was you had to first of all find evidence for the words or the new uses of words that you were going to try and put into the dictionary. And then you had to go to the Bodleian Library and went into the stacks, and there were all the books that you could just roam around. So you were some sort of term from ice hockey or something. You would get, because the idea was to try and find the earliest possible usage of the word. And so you'd have to be given a term from ice hockey. You go to the stacks of the Bodleian Library, and there are these 30 books on ice hockey, and you slowly work your way back, chronologically, you slowly work your way back until you found puck or whatever it was. But I only worked on letters C to H. If you're thinking about, with a bit of B, and if you're thinking about dirty words, then that's most of them.
Good to know.
And I'd also say, if we're thinking about the C word, the first found use of it in the English language is as a 13th century street name in London.
No way.
Yeah, it was called Great C. Lane. Without the Oxford English Dictionary.
Is it a bit like the whole tenderloin thing in San Francisco?
I suppose so, yes.
Because once you look into that, you're like, oh, okay, that's what that's about.
Yes.
It's because everybody was getting STDs going down there. Like, this is what I read anyway.
Yeah, of course, we use that a lot. Yeah, I read it too.
So I heard. But when did you first think that you had something to say as a writer?
Oh, not until I published about 2 books, I think. I didn't think of myself as a writer. I thought, it's not like your dad's a publican, you take on the pub. Even if your dad is a writer, you don't necessarily become a writer. You might be put off being a writer. I wanted to become a good reader. And then when I was working on the dictionary, I started to get a little bit of reviewing. And I'd read by that time Cyril Connolly's famous book, Enemies of Promise, which is all about the different sorts of enemies of literary promise and the things that will stop you and take you down. The most famous of all is the Pranning Hall, as he calls it. And one of them was journalism, because he thought that journalism was the enemy of literature. I found it a help, actually.
In what way?
Well, if you have very little confidence that you have anything to say which people might want to listen to, if you're writing a 400-word book review in a provincial paper, then, and no one sort of comes up to you and says, rubbish, you can't do it, you don't know what you're talking about, then you gradually get your confidence. And I started writing some kind of novel after about 2 or 3 years in journalism, but it took me 7 years, and it's only 180 pages.
Is this Metroland?
It's Metroland, yes.
And, from the outside, reading about you and having interviewed you at a certain point further back, I had got the sense of you and Martin Amis as being these kind of literary titans that came in to be quite competitive with what had come before and almost tear down the previous generation. Did you have that sense?
I didn't, not not to tear down the previous generation. I was censorious about members of the previous generation I thought weren't much good, but then that's entirely normal. and I now fall into the category in advance in my career. There are now two generations, but unfortunately the younger one is sort of rushing the one in between them and me. This is normal. This is normal literary life. It's carnivorous.
Okay, well, I'm going to find out a bit more about your particular bugbears in terms of your contemporaries in a little while.
Yeah.
But of course, we would love if you could read something from your work today. And you've picked out a particular short story, so maybe you could tell us a little bit about it.
Yes. Yeah, I'm going to read from there, but I wrote this story either between 15 and 20 years ago, and it's called The Story of Mats Israelson. And I wanted to write a story about a love affair which was interrupted and frozen at a certain point. And then the couple were forced to live in the same town or village for most of the rest of their lives with this unresolved and not voiced. And I was trying to think of where it might be set and when it might be set, because sometimes you start with a place, and sometimes you start with a person, and sometimes you start with a situation. So, if you set a story like that in contemporary America, it wouldn't work, because one of the two would get a U-Haul truck and take all their belongings to the other end of America. So I was thinking, some village, small town, and I was drifting. I thought maybe continental Europe, drifting towards North Germany in a funny sort of way. This is what you do, you sort of mooch around before you settle on things. And I love collecting old Baedeker guides, and I love old reference guides. If you want to feel what it's like in the 19th century somewhere, you don't look up, you don't Google it, because that's the view from here now of what it was like then. What you want is the view from then of what it was like. And so I had a Baedeker guide to Norway and Sweden, and I was just drifting through it, and I found a story called The Story of Mats Israelson, which was a real story that really happened. And there's something about that which made it immediately a kind of central image for this story that I wanted to write. This will become clearer. I'm going to read the first third of the story, and it ends with telling you what the story of Mats Israelson is.
Lovely.
So we're in Sweden, southern Sweden, in about 1898. In front of the church, which contained a carved altar brought from Germany during the 30 Years' War, there stood a row of 6 horse stalls. Made from white fur, cut and seasoned within a guard's cry at the town's crossroads, they were undecorated, even unnumbered. Yet their simplicity and apparent availability were deceptive. In the heads of those who rode to church, and also those who walked, the stalls were numbered from left to right, with the numbers 1 to 6, and were reserved for the 6 most prominent men in the neighbourhood. There was no surprise when Anders Daudet was awarded the 4th stall. The general manager of the sawmill was noted for his industry, lack of frivolity, and devotion to his family. If he was not unduly devout, he was charitable. One autumn, when the shooting had been good, he had filled one of the saw pits with scrap timber, laid a metal grid across the top, and cooked a deer whose meat he distributed among his workmen. Though not born to the town, he took it upon himself to show others its sights. Visitors would find themselves, at his insistence, climbing the bell tower beside the church, leaning one arm against the bell lock, and this would point out brickworks. Beyond it, the deaf and dumb asylum. And just out of sight, the statue marking the spot where Gustav Vasa addressed the Dalecarlians in 1520. A hefty, bearded, and enthusiastic man, he would even suggest a pilgrimage to the Högberg. Gossip said that Anders Daudet spent so long with visitors to the town because this delayed his return home. Gossip repeated that the first time he'd asked Gertrude to marry him, she had laughed in his beard, and only began to see his virtues after her own disappointment in love with the Macalius boy. Gossip speculated that when Gertrude's father had come to Anders and suggested he renew his ring, negotiations had not been simple. But the marriage had prospered as far as gossip could tell, even if she was known to call him a whore on public occasions. When the pharmacist Axel Lindvall and his wife Barbara came to town, Anders Daudet took them up the bell tower and offered to walk them to the Högberg. On his return home, Gertrude asked why he was not wearing the club button of the Swedish Tourist Union. Because I'm not a member. They ought to make an honorary one, she replied. Anders had learned to deal with his wife's sarcasm by means of pedantry, by answering her questions as if they meant no more than the words they contained. This tended to annoy her further, but for him it was a necessary protection. They seem an agreeable couple, he said, matter-of-factly. You like everybody. No, my love, I do not think that is true. He meant, for instance, that at the present moment, he did not like her. You are more discriminating about logs than about members of the human race. Logs, my love, were very different one from another. The arrival of the Lindvalls in the town caused no special interest. Those who sought Axel Lindvall's professional advice found all they could hope for in a pharmacist. Someone slow and serious, who flatteringly regarded all complaints as life-threatening, while at the same time judging them curable. He was a short, flaxen-haired man. Gossip wagered that he would run fat. Mrs. Lindvall was less remarked upon, being either menacingly pretty or contemptibly plain, neither vulgar nor slummier in dress, neither pushy nor reclusive in manner. She was just a new wife, and therefore one who should wait her turn. As incomers, the Lindvalls kept to themselves, which was proper, while regularly attending church, which was also proper. Gossip said that when Axel first handed Barbara into the rowing boat they had acquired that summer, she had asked him anxiously, "Are you sure, Axel, that there are no sharks in the lake?" But Gossip, in his honesty, could not be certain that Mrs. Lindvall was not taking a joke. Once a fortnight, on a Tuesday, Anders Daudet would take the steamboat up the lake to inspect the seasoning sheds. He was standing at the rail by the first-class cabin when he became aware of a presence beside him. Mrs. Lindvall. As he spoke, his wife's words came into his head. She's got less chin on her than a squirrel. Embarrassed, he looked across at the shoreline and said, "There's the brickworks." "Yes." And a moment later, "And the deaf and dumb asylum." "Yes." "Of course." He realized he pointed them out to her from the back town. She was wearing a straw gaiter with a blue ribbon. 2 weeks later, she was on the steamer again. She had a sister who lived just beyond Redvik. He tried to make himself interesting to her. He asked if she and her husband had yet visited the cellar where Gustav Vasa had been concealed from his Danish pursuers. He explained about the forest, the way its colours and textures changed with the seasons, and how, even from the boat, he could tell the manner in which it was being worked, where someone else would merely see a mass of trees. She followed his pointing arm politely. He realized that he had never developed a way of talking to women, and that up till now it had never bothered him. "I'm sorry," he said. "My wife maintains that I should be wearing the club button of the Swedish Tourists Union." "I like a man who tells me what he knows," replied Mrs. Millay. Her words confused him. Were they a criticism of Gertrude, an encouragement to him, or a mere statement of fact? At supper that evening, his wife said, "What do you talk to Mrs. Lindwall about?" He did not know what to reply, or rather how to reply. But as usual, he took refuge in the simplest meanings of the words and pretended no surprise at the question. "The forest. I was explaining about the forest." "And was she interested?" "In the forest, I mean. She grew up in the city. She has not seen so many trees until she came to this region." "Well," said Gertrude, "there are an awful lot of trees in the forest, aren't there, Anders?" He wanted to say she was more interested in the forest than you have ever been. He wanted to say you were unkind about her looks. He wanted to say who saw me talking to her. He said none of this. Over the next fortnight, he found himself reflecting that Barbara was a name with a lovely weight to it, and softer sounding than other names. He thought also that a blue ribbon around his straw hat made his heart cheerful. On the Tuesday, as he was leaving, Gertrude said, "Give my regards to this little Mrs. Lindwall." He suddenly wanted to say, "And what if I fall in love with her?" Instead, he replied, "I shall let her see." On the steamer, he barely managed the normal slow civilities. Before they had cast off, he began telling her what he knew. About timber, how it is grown, transported, hewn. He explained about bastard soil and quarter soil. He explained that the three parts of the trunk. He explained about the three parts of the trunk: pith, heartwood, and sapwood. In trees which have arrived at maturity, the heartwood is in the largest proportion, and the sapwood is firm and elastic. "A tree is like a man," he said. "It takes 70 years and 10 to arrive at maturity, and is useless after 100. He told her how once at Berwick, where an iron bridge spans the rapids, he had watched 400 men at work catching the logs as they emerged from the river. He explained to her, like a man of the world, the different systems of marking. Swedish timber is stenciled in red letters, with inferior timber wood marked in blue. Norwegian timber is stenciled in blue at both ends with the shipper's initials. Russian timber is scribed in the sides near the middle. Russian timber is dry stamped or hand-marked at the ends. Canadian timber is stenciled in black and white. American timber is marked with red chalk on the sides. "Have you seen all this?" she asked. He admitted that he had not yet examined North American timber. He had only read about it. So each man knows his own log," she answered. "Of course, otherwise a man might steal another's log." He couldn't tell if she was laughing at him, indeed, at the whole world of men. Suddenly there was a flash from the shoreline. "There is a belvedere, probably someone with a spyglass. We are under surveillance." But he lost confidence as he pronounced the last word. It sounded like something another man might say. "Why?" He didn't know what to reply. He looked away to the shoreline where the belvedere flashed again. Embarrassed, he told her the story of Mats Israelson. But he told it in the wrong order, and too quickly, and she did not appear interested. She did not even seem to realize that it was true. "I'm sorry," she said, as if aware of his disappointment. "I have little imagination. I'm only interested in what really happens. Legends seem to me silly. We have too many of them in our country. Scholes replied his opinion. He says, I'm not showing honour to my country. He says that people will take me for modern women. But it is not that either. It is that I have little imagination." Anders found this solemn speech calming. It was as if she were giving him guidance. Still looking across at the shore, he told her about a visit he'd once made to the copper mine, at Farnham. He told her only the things that really happened. He told her that it was the greatest copper mine in the world, after those of Lake Superior, that it had been worked since the 13th century, that it cost 2 riksdaler for admission, that gunshots were extra. Gunshots are extra? Yes. What are the gunshots for? To awaken the echoes. He told her that visitors usually telephoned ahead to the mine in Farnham to announce their arrival, that they were given miners' attire, and accompanied by a miner, that on the descent the steps were lit by torches, that it cost 2 riksdaler. He had told her that already. Her eyebrows, he noticed, were strongly marked and darker than the hair of her head. She said, "I would like to visit Farnham." That evening, he could tell the Emperor was in a temper. Eventually, she said, "A wife has a right to a husband's discretion when he arranges a rendezvous with his mistress." Each noun rang like a dead crump from the belter. He merely looked at her. She continued, "At least I should be grateful for your naivety. Other men would at least wait until the steamer was out of sight of the jetty before starting their canoodling." "You are deluded," he said. "If my father were less of a businessman," she replied, "he would shoot you." "Then your father should be grateful that the husband of Mrs. Alfredson, who runs the conditorry behind the church in Retwick, is also just such a businessman." It was too long a sentence, he felt, but it did its work. That night, Anders Daudet lined up all the insults he'd received from his wife and stacked them as neat as any woodcarver. If that is what she's capable of believing, he thought, then this is what is capable of happening. Except that Anders Daudet did not want a mistress. He did not want some woman in a pastry shop to whom he would give presents and about whom he would boast in rooms where men smoked small cigars together. He thought, of course, now I see. The fact is, I've been in love with her since we first met on this steamboat. I wouldn't have come to it so soon had not Gertrude helped me there. I never imagined her sarcasm had any use. But this time it did. For the next 2 weeks, he did not allow himself to breathe. He did not mean to breathe because everything was now clear and real and decided. He went about his work and in free moments thought about how she had not attended to the story of Mats Israelson. She assumed it was a legend. He had told her badly, he knew. And so he began practicing, like a schoolboy learning a poem. He would tell it to her again, and this time she would know, simply from the way he told it, that it was true. It didn't take very long, but it was important that he learned to narrate it just as he had narrated the visit to the mine. In 1719, he began, with some fear that the distant date might bore her, but also convinced that it gave the story authenticity. In 1719, he began, standing on the dock, waiting for the return steamer. A body was discovered in the copper mine at Farnham. The body, he continued, watching the shoreline, was that of a young man, Mats Israelson, who had perished in the mines 49 years previously. The body, he informed the gulls which were raucously inspecting the boat, was in a state of perfect preservation. The reason for this, he explained in some detail to the Belvedere, to the deaf and dumb asylum, to the brickworks, was that the fumes of the copper vitriol had inhibited decomposition. They knew that the body was that of Mats Israelson, he moaned to the dockhand on the jetty hatching the throwing rope, was because it was identified by an aged crone who had once known him. 49 years earlier, he concluded, this time under his breath, in hot sleeplessness as his wife growled gently beside him and the wind flapped the curtain. 49 years earlier, when Mats Israelson had disappeared, that old woman, then as young as him, had been his fiancée. He remembered the way she had been placing them, her hand on the rail so that her wedding ring was not concealed, and had said simply, "I would like to visit Father." He imagined other women saying to him, "I long for Stockholm," or "At nights I dream of Venice." They would be challenging women with city furs, and they would not be interested in any response except cap doffing awe. But she had said, "I would like to visit Farnham," and the simplicity of it had made him unable to answer. He practiced saying, with equal simplicity, "I shall take you there." He convinced himself that if he were to tell the story of Mats Israelson correctly, it would make her say once more, "I would like to visit Farnham," and then he would reply, "I shall take you there," and everything would be decided. So he worked at the story until he had it in a form that would please her, simple, hard, true. He would tell it to her 10 minutes after he passed off, at what he already thought of as their place, by the rail, outside the first-class cabin. He ran through the story one final time as he reached the jetty. It was the first Tuesday in the month of June. You had to be precise about dates, 1719 to begin with, and to end with the first Tuesday of June in the year of our Lord, 1898. The sky was bright, the lake was pure, the gulls were discreet, the forest on the hillside behind the town was full of trees that were as straight and honest as a man. She did not come.
Absolutely gorgeous and beautifully read. Julian, the short story as a form, so many people struggle with it. There are so many writers who can either do novels or short stories, but not the two. Do you see them as sort of radically different from each other?
Yes, I do. It's rather odd. I found that I wasn't able to and didn't want to write a short story till I'd written about 5 novels, and then ideas started coming to me which seemed to be okay for short stories, and I wrote 3 collections over about 15 years or so, and I haven't had an idea for a short story since. So it's very strange where they come from. Maybe, I mean, short story is closer to poetry in various ways, in that, well, you can imagine a perfect poem, you know a perfect poem, you can imagine a perfect short story, but you can't really imagine a perfect novel. Randall Jarrell, the American poet's famous definition of a novel was a long piece of prose with something wrong with it. Which is right. And in parallel, my friend Helen Simpson, English short story writer, who I think is probably our best short story writer at the moment, she was once asked to define a short story, and she said, "It's a novel with the boring bits left out." And so in that sense, they're kind of incompatible. And most writers, you're correct, most writers are better at one or the other. I mean, I think I'm a much better novelist than a short story writer. I think when I wrote them, of course, when you write something, you think it's as good as it can possibly be. And I used to think my short stories were terrific, but I'm not so sure anymore. I mean, I'm very fond of one or two of them. I'm fond of that one. And I think it works. And I think one of the reasons it's interesting or different is that it takes 2 lives and it takes them all the way through, more or less from the beginning to the end. And it's very hard to do that in a short story. I mean, there are some who do it extraordinarily well, like Alice Munro, who is a great Canadian short story writer. And she somehow manages to move through time. And it's happening, and yet you don't quite understand how it's happening. How did she do that? How do we suddenly think we know what happened in those 15 years when she hasn't really told us?
Jarring, which is
It's clearly something that is natural to some short story writers and only acquired later by others. I mean, John Updike, who was a brilliant short story writer at the beginning of his career, then tended to use sort of short stories were like offcuts when you were working to bench, writing novels. And then towards the end, he really discovered how to move through time and look through a whole life in 15 pages.
Do you read William Trevor much?
Oh yes, William Trevor is someone who is equally good at both, absolutely equally good at both. Brilliant novelist, wonderful short story writer. I loved his vast collection, which he gracefully left us with. Now I met him once, and he seemed to be a wonderful, wonderful man, and he was clearly a wonderful writer.
Are you very technical in terms of when you sit down to write, whether it's a novel or a short story, do you plan much? Are you at a computer with Microsoft Word, or are you using one of those programs like Scrivener? Are you using an old-fashioned pen? What is your process?
It varies. I never write on a computer. I tried it once. I was writing a book called Arthur and George, which was about Arthur Conan Doyle and his attempt to solve the real-life crimes. And he was a great spiritualist and believed in all those things. And at the time, I had two electric typewriters, IBM 196C, which was a point at which the technology, the advanced technology, matched the enormous size of the object. I had these two typewriters. One was a backup. And at a time when I was writing a passage which was somewhat mocking of Arthur Conan Doyle's spiritualism, they both broke down. And so I thought, well, this is the time to discover how to write on a computer. I mean, I used a computer for letters and journalism and that sort of stuff, but not for fiction. And I tried, and I wrote about 3 chapters of it, and it didn't work at all. I'm not quite sure what it is. I think it's that it's somehow easy to correct on a screen, and there's something about the laboriousness of writing fiction that seems to me to make it come out right. And that I would correct a lot on the screen, and then I print it out, but it didn't look like the first draft at all to me. What a first draft, I like to do a fairly fast first draft on my electric typewriter, and then correct over it many times until you can't read it, and then you do another draft. And I didn't see the parallel technique process with the computer. I mean, my friend Ian McEwan always works on the computer, and he says he likes it. Was that me? Was that and he says that he likes it because he finds that the way a computer works matches the way that his brain works, the way by extension our brain works. But I've obviously not got the right sort of brain in that case.
And do you plan it, do you know the end before?
It varies greatly. I think when I write when I write a short story, I have a rough idea, and then but I don't really plan it. Maybe that's why they aren't as good as my novels. But when I write anything extended, at a certain point I tend to take a big piece of card out and write things in the order that they happen, arrows pointing and that sort of thing. And no, you don't always end up with the ending that you think you might get. John Irving, the American writer, always starts by writing the ending of his novels. So he knows where he's going to get to 500 or 1,000 pages later. But I don't start at the beginning because I don't know what the beginning is. I start often at an area of central interest, or this is a key scene that the novel needs. If I get that in place, then I can work backwards and work forward. In a way, the book tells you how to write it in a funny kind of way.
Well, one of my favourite books of yours is a non-fiction book actually called Levels of Life. And I don't know if many of you here have read it, but it's got a very powerful section in the book which is devoted to your late wife, Pat Kavanagh. And I wonder, what the process of writing that account was like, because the grief that comes through that section is so beautifully expressed and so sharp, and there's so much hurt and pain in it. And I wondered if it was cathartic for you or very difficult for you. What was that like?
Well, to start at the end, no, it wasn't cathartic. I never think that writing books or writing about myself, which I do very rarely, I never think that art is cathartic to the artist, it might be cathartic to the reader. And in this case, it has been cathartic or helpful for many, many readers. But I never thought when I started, a friend asked me halfway through, said, does it help? And I said no, and I didn't expect it to. But I thought one of my primary reasons was that I think grief, death and grief are misunderstood or badly understood or brushed aside. I don't know how it is in Ireland, but in England...
It's the same, actually, because
Yeah.
you've got a moment in that, and I remember it very sharply because I think your wife had passed away in 2008, and a year later my father had died of the same cancer. So when I read it, it was very acute to me. But you describe in that part of the book about how you would be at a dinner party and you might mention the name of your wife 3 times, and 3 times people would brush over and talk about something else, look uncomfortable, and that angered you because you wanted her to be remembered and heard.
Yes, and these were three people who would have known her for about 30 years each and would have said that they loved her. And they weren't capable. They were men, of course. Men are much worse than women at grief, I think, and grown-ups are probably worse than the young. Quite straightforward about it, I think, or more open to understanding it. So I wanted, a lot of the impetus behind writing is to say the world is not like that, it's like this. And a realistic novel is by its nature corrective. By its nature, it's saying, no, this is what it's really like. And so that impulse was certainly there. Also, there wasn't very much on grief. I mean, a year or 2 after my wife died, there was a book by Joan Didion, and also one by
George Carroll's?
George Carroll's, exactly. Yes, and I sort of reviewed them, and they're both good in their different ways, and they both play to the strengths of each writer. You would expect that. But I felt that there was, death is not dignified. Grief is not dignified. The undignified nature of it, the savage nature of it, the anger that comes out, the way in which you can't be helped because you don't know what help you need. You can't define it. And so you're being angry with people who are trying to help you as best they can, and you can't see that till later. You just say, that's no use to me. Inside, a lot of it is all internalized.
It was a lovely letter that somebody wrote to you, though, that the words in the letter you still use now. Maybe you could tell us. It was the line, I think, that it was, if it didn't matter.
Oh, yes. This was a widow about 10 years older than me. And she wrote to me after Pat died, and she said, nature is very exact in the matter, in the subject. Nature is very, what did I say? Accurate? No.
Exact.
Exact. Nature is very exact. Nature is very exact, : if it didn't matter, it wouldn't matter. It's perfect. It's perfect. It's a perfect way, yes. And so therefore, the measure of grief is the measure of love, it seems to me, and grief is the negative image of love, which is the positive image.
Well, in your fiction, and particularly in your most recent work, The Only Story, it's a depiction of love, actually, but love between 2 kind of unlikely subjects, a 19-year-old and a woman who, as you put it in the book, is old enough to be his mother. And it's actually a gorgeous characterization of love through the book, even though things don't go smoothly and things get very difficult indeed. But I wonder, when you write now, and when you write about love or friendship, how much of yourself do you put into those works?
About as much as when I was first writing about it. And if you're asking anything closer to home, wait for the posthumous biography.
Right.
No, it's the truth. When you write about love or sex or both, people assume it must be autobiographical. Yet the truth is that if you're a fiction writer, it's much easier to imagine someone else's love life and sex life than it is to imagine their financial life, for example, or their mortgage situation, or what their job is like. I mean, maybe novelists who are good at imagining all that stuff, but I'm not. So obviously you use what you know, what you're foolish not to. And obviously at some point in some books there's an alloy between what you've experienced and what you're guessing and what you're inventing. But it's of no use to the writer to say, oh, that paragraph there, that really happened. Because then your novel starts falling apart into different bits, So I don't understand.
Okay, so have you got a lot of unpublished work squirreled away somewhere so that...
I wish I had. I could start publishing it, yes.
I won't keep you too much longer, I'm conscious of the time, but I just... I wanted to kind of ask you a little bit about, where you feel that you exist now, kind of in that sort of contemporary authors, because, there's... Salman Rushdie Publishing, you have a new book actually due in November, and there was a time when, for example, the Booker Prize itself, if you had a novel on the Booker Prize shortlist, that would be sufficient to mean that it would sell an incredible volume of books in the shops, whereas now things are slightly different. It's true, Anna Burns did very well.
Yes, I'm reading it at the moment.
Yeah,
my paperback says 500,000 copies sold. I didn't get that.
Absolutely. I bought it in 2011, yeah. But it's a strange time because literary fiction has come through many different sort of incarnations, if you like. At some certain points we've said the novel is dead, at other points it seemed like the Booker was the only thing people were talking about, and now there's maybe a different type of fiction again coming up with younger writers who have grown up with the internet, with this kind of always on feeling, and it's a very different sensibility. The writers like Sally Rooney, for example, are writing a very particular kind of fiction. So I wonder what you think of the, I suppose, literary firmament now, and whether it's as healthy as it always is, and what do your publishing houses say?
What does my publisher
say? A lot of writers.
My publisher is in the audience, so they're incredibly generous and kind.
I've heard from a lot of authors who would say that there was a golden period where the advances were enormous and books flew out the shops.
No, I don't think that's really true. I think there was a time, maybe in the 80s, when there was books, literary fiction seemed promotable. There was, Grant, Best of Young British or whatever. Young men under 40, best of middle-aged fiction. And also it was, you can't really generalise, but the British novel seemed at that point to become slightly more international, and the British novel contained, Ishiguro, Rushdie, Hanif Qureshi, and so on and so forth. It sounds as if new voices were coming in. I think, it's a bit like farmers, it's always a bad year sometimes. And I think that's what publishers would say, and it's also what writers might say. But I think each new generation that comes along is surprised that the novel is still there. And I remember the equivalent to this, of what you're saying about the new generation, is that when I was first looking to write a novel, I somehow thought, well, maybe all the narrative energy will be going into television, and that novels will seem like a very old-fashioned and complex thing, like origami, not real flower arranging, and not that there's anything wrong with flower arranging. It's very well done. I'm confident that the novel will survive, and the novel in all its forms, from demotic to academic to very close to life to fantastical. It's always been a very varied and vibrant form, but when you come down to it, it's someone listening to someone else. It's someone in the privacy of their own brain and heart, listening to something that is directed by another person they can't see, of their brain and their heart and their soul. And it's very, very intimate, and yet it talks about the most serious things in life. So unless our civilization becomes more trivial, I think the novel will do okay.
Do all those prizes matter to you in an emotional sense?
Do all those?
The prizes, the Booker Prize, the honours you've received from France, the Lifetime Achievement Awards.
I used to say and think, therefore that's why I said it, that the prizes were for the encouragement of the young and the consolation of the old. And then middle age, you just get on with it. and in a funny kind of way, you know, I did win quite a few prizes when I was starting off, and then there was a fallow 20 years or more, and then I become advanced. And then I win the Booker Prize, you see. That's the last time I said it.
We began our chat by talking a little bit about your relationship with France and how your books have done incredibly well there. You visit France, and you visited France as a youth. So you're very multicultural, European, dare I say.
Yeah, I'm definitely European. I'm English and European, I'm not British.
And we're coming up to October 31st.
Yeah.
So how are you feeling?
There's been very little to cheer the heart of a pro-European English person, except Schadenfreude. I experienced great Schadenfreude when it became clear that after many years of not having the whammy on Britain, Ireland suddenly had the whammy. It was very cheering to see. And also when, I remember Mrs. Merkel said to Munster for Africa, "We are more behind you on this than on anything else," like the border question. I mean, he rather wittily said, "That worried me a bit, you know." Of course, you're not behind us very much on other things. And the other source of Schadenfreude is Boris Johnson and his fantastic capacity to fuck it up. It was all being caused by David Cameron and Boris Johnson, and so my modest proposal is that before any more laws are passed, we pass a law forbidding an old Etonian from being Prime Minister for the next 50 years.
We mentioned the new book coming in November, so before we close, can you give us a little insight as to what that will be like?
Brilliant.
I wasn't able to get an advance copy, so I have no help in talking about this, so you're going to have to do it.
Well, about 5 years ago, I went to an exhibition of portraits by John Singer Sargent at the National Portrait Gallery, and at the end of one of the rooms, there was an astonishing full-length portrait of a man in a scarlet coat, neck to ankles. And I'd never seen it before, partly because it had been in private ownership until about 1990, and then only been in Los Angeles. And it was one of the best portraits in the show, and I thought, who's that? And I looked at the label and it said it was Samuel Potsy, P-O-Z-Z-I, a famous society gynecologist. And I thought, I know 19th century France, especially the second half, pretty well. I've never come across this guy. And so I just thought I'd try and find out about him. And he was he was indeed a society gynecologist who also ran a very, very basic STD hospital in a poor part of Paris, which you had to do and just look after posh people. And he was a gynecologist to high society writers, painters, and their wives, and so on and so forth. And he had a famously complicated private life, which I won't tell you about, and which sets the fact that he was a gynecologist in somewhat opposition to how he behaved in his private life. And you'll just have to read it. And also, it's got wonderful pictures. It's got wonderful pictures, and it's beautifully produced by my adored publishers.
All right, Julian Barnes, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.